Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to our last study on the book of Ezekiel. For the past year, for the past 11 tapes, we have been examining the book of Ezekiel and looking at what God's marvelous plan for Israel was all about. Ezekiel is in Babylon because of Israel's apostasy. And God reveals a host of things that are very interesting to Ezekiel about the nation, about himself and his plans, about the future, about what Plan A was all about. Now, in our next seminar segment, starting in the month of July, we're going to be examining the book of Daniel because Daniel and Ezekiel are written at the same time. Both men are in Babylon. Both men are approximately the same age. And we're going to find that it's interesting what God is telling Daniel is so different than what he's telling Ezekiel. Because if Plan A had been implemented, the book of Daniel would have forever remained sealed up and its contents would have never been understood. Because there would be no point. The book of Daniel would not have come to pass. That's why in Daniel 9 says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people to make atonement for sin, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up vision and prophecy. Everything given to Daniel was to be sealed up and would have never been fulfilled if Plan A had taken place. Well, Plan A didn't take place, so Plan B, Daniel is all about Plan B. And we're going to be examining that starting in the month of July 2003, and I hope that you will take advantage of our tapes and subscribe. Okay, we're going to begin now starting with Ezekiel 40, and I want to take you through these last few chapters of the book and give you an idea of what this temple is all about. Let me take you to the computer screen and put a couple of things on the screen here for you to look at. 586 BC is the year that Nebuchadnezzar, in his third siege against Jerusalem, finally destroyed the temple that Solomon had built approximately 420 years earlier, or actually 380 years earlier. Solomon's temple lasted about 400 years in round figures. 586 BC is a very widely accepted date. Historically, it's been validated many times. It's a very secure date. Ezekiel chapter 40 comes to Ezekiel about 14 years after the destruction of the temple in 573 BC. In this vision that God gives to Ezekiel, God is giving plans for a new temple, which was to be built where the old temple had once stood. Under Plan A, God was going to restore His people. Under Plan A, God was going to bring back from all the nations where He had scattered them. And so we have a series of decrees that actually were given. Cyrus gave a decree, and then we have Darius giving a decree. Cyrus and Darius, that's right. And then we have Artaxerxes giving 2 decrees. So we have a total of 4 decrees for the returning and the restoration of Israel to their homeland and to the rebuilding of the temple. Well, the temple that God wanted built is one more magnificent temple. And when Zerubbabel began to look at what God had written, or Ezekiel had written, God had told Ezekiel, Zerubbabel was overwhelmed with the plans of the temple because the returning refugees were so poor and did not have labor and did not have materials enough to build this temple, that God sent him the message, in the book of Zechariah, be of good courage, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. This temple would have been built. God would have enabled it, just like He enabled the building of Solomon's temple, if Israel had been faithful. But this temple was never built. That was a first clue. Something dreadful was going wrong. Now, let's go to the scripture and notice. Ezekiel writes, in the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of the city, on that very day, the 10th day, the first month, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and He took me there. In visions of God, He took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, and on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. Now, Ezekiel's in vision. You can obviously tell. He took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord. His appearance is like bronze, shiny, very bright. And he's holding a linen cord, a measuring line, a tape measure, and a measuring rod in his hand. The man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you. For that is why you have been brought here. Tell the house of Israel everything you see. Okay, Ezekiel says, I saw a wall completely surrounding the temple area. The length of the measuring rod in the man's hand was 6 cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. He measured the wall, and it was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. So this rod is 6 cubits long, which is approximately about 9 feet. 9 feet, 6 cubits, and he sees a wall that's 9 feet tall, 9 feet thick. Then he went to the gate facing east, and he climbed its steps and measured the threshold of the gate. It was 1 rod deep, 9 feet. Okay, now I'm going to skip on to chapter 43, because you can read starting at chapter 40 the intricate details that are given. These intricate details are given because Ezekiel is to this new temple that is to be built under Plan A. Ezekiel is to that temple what Moses was, the pattern given to Moses on the mount for the temple, that the sanctuary that was built in the wilderness. God is very particular about His temple because, for a very particular, interesting reason. Let me try to explain this for a minute, and why all of this detail is found at the end of the book of Ezekiel. Let's suppose that you know nothing about the game of chess. Absolutely nothing. And let's suppose that you are of average intelligence and you go into a room where 2 people are playing chess. As you sit there and as you watch them play, if you do so long enough, you should be able to figure out the rules of the game. You should be able to figure out how the game works and who wins, and what it takes to win. You will discover as you watch the game played how that the bishop moves in diagonal directions. You'll notice how the rook can only move in perpendicular direction. You will notice how the queen can move in any direction. You'll notice how the pawns can move. You'll notice how the knights move in their strange little hops of 2 forward and 1 left or 1 right. So after a while of watching the chess game, you will know how each of the players move. In other words, by observing, you will come to understand the rules. And as you study and as you watch the game played by masters, You will begin to understand strategy, and you will understand how good chess players give up pawns in order to gain a greater treasure, in order to gain a greater player. And so the whole intricate game of chess can be learned by observation. Does that make sense? God, the ways of God are in His temple. By studying God's ways in His temple, you can understand the issues of the plan of salvation. By watching how the high priest and the priests serve, and what they are allowed to do and what they are told to do, and when they do it, by watching this whole infrastructure, think of the whole sanctuary service as a big game. And as you watch it, you begin to understand the terms and conditions of salvation. That's why God told Moses, see to it that when you make the tabernacle, that you follow the pattern exactly as I have shown it to you. Because for centuries to come, men will be studying, men and women will be studying this temple to understand my ways. And in fact, that's how I test all of my views about salvation, about the plan of salvation, about God's economy of salvation, about restitution, about the disposition of sin, about the transferment of sin. Everything concerning the plan of salvation is seen in the sanctuary service. And that's why it's so crucial that it's built right and that the players who perform their tasks there do them precisely as required by law. Doing the tasks do not have efficacy in and of themselves. This means that when the priests are slaying the animals and putting their blood on the horns, they are not really transferring sin. They are representing how sin is transferred through the blood of the Lamb of God to the altar in heaven. The priests on earth there's no efficacy in what they do. Paul makes it clear in the book of Hebrews, the blood of goats and bulls never cleansed anybody of sin. It's the imagery, it's the game, it's the structure. And as you watch what they do and how they go about it and how it is involved, you begin to understand without dispute what the plan of salvation is all about and how it works. So this is why God wanted the temple built, the one He's describing to Ezekiel, so carefully. And that's why everything is measured out. Measurements are very critical to the Lord. Numbers are critical. Timing is critical. All of these pieces are critical. They all have something to say. That's why the model is so critical. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to jump down to chapter 43. You can read the whole thing later, but I'm just trying to give you an understanding of what we're talking about. So in chapter 43, verse 1, then the man brought me to the gate facing east, and I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. So His voice was like the roar of rushing waters. This is, of course, Jesus. And the land was radiant with His glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when He came to destroy the city. Same one. Member of the Godhead. It's Jesus. When He came to destroy Jerusalem, and like the visions I had seen by the Kibar River, and I fell face down. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. Son of man, he said, this is the place of my throne. Now watch carefully under plan A. This is the place of my throne, and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The house of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the lifeless idols of their kings at their high places. In other words, a time is coming when sin will be no more among my people, and they will never again defile my holy name. And I will live among them, and this room here is where I will live. This place will be the place for the soles of my feet, and this is the place of my throne. Okay, everybody clear on that? When they placed their threshold next to my threshold, and their doorposts beside my doorposts, with only a wall between them and me, they defiled my holy name, Ezekiel, with their detestable practices. What he's referring to here is that in the temple that was destroyed, it was defiled because they had brought their idols in and put them in the temple beside the sacred room where the Lord existed. The temple that was built by Solomon had many antechambers beside it, and they placed their idols and their thresholds next to the doorposts and threshold for where the worship of the true God was conducted. And the Lord says, they defiled my holy name by their detestable practices. So I destroyed them and that temple, incidentally, in my anger. Now let them put away from me their prostitution and the lifeless idols of their kings, and I will live among them forever. Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider the plan. Okay, let them watch. Let them examine and study the game of chess, is what he's saying. And if they are ashamed of all they have done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design and all its regulation and laws. Write these down before them so that they may be faithful to its design, the pattern, the plan, and follow all its regulations. See, it's important to God because the ways of God are in His temple. And if you want to understand the issues of salvation, you've got to study His temple. There's no other way. That's why the doctrine, incidentally, that's why the doctrine of parallel temples is so crucial. That's one, of the five essential doctrines, one of the 5 S's, the parallel sanctuaries. God has one on earth, He has one in heaven, because the one on earth is a model of how things are done in heaven. It's sort of like plan A, plan B, but I won't go there with that for now. Let's go back to the Bible. Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 1. Then the man brought me to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, and it was shut. And the Lord said to me, this gate is to remain shut. It must not be opened. No one may enter through it. It is to remain shut because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it. It's interesting, He comes out of the east into His temple. And if you will study the way the temple is oriented, it faces east. Now, the prince, this is a reference to the king. The prince himself is the only one who may sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of the Lord. Remember, David was going to sit on the throne, and eventually, at the resurrection of David, he would be the prince that's being described here. But the prince is to enter by the way of the portico of the gateway and go out the same way. He is not to go through the east gate. Only the Lord goes through that gate. This is kind of interesting. When Jesus, told His disciples, I am the sheep gate. I am the way. No man comes unto the Father except through me. The use of language and the ideas that it represents are truly amazing. So, verse 4, Then the man brought me by the way of the north gate to the front of the temple. I looked and saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple of the Lord, and I fell face down. I'm going to jump down to chapter 48, verse 29. Again, I invite you to read all the details. It's interesting how it was to see if you can put it down on paper. See if you can draw it out. This is the land you are to allot as an inheritance to the tribes of Israel, and these will be their portions, declares the sovereign Lord. These will be the exits to the city, beginning on the north side, which is 4,500 cubits long, which is about 1.25 miles. The gates of the city will be named after the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, isn't that interesting? The holy city. The gates of the city are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. The 3 gates on the north side will be the gate of Reuben, the gate of Judah, and the gate of Levi. The north side being significant, the powerful side. The gate of Levi, the gate of Reuben, and the gate of Judah. On the east side, which is also 1.25 miles long, there will be 3 gates, the gate of Joseph, the gate of Benjamin, and the gate of Dan. Sometimes Joseph is called the tribe of Ephraim as well. Verse 33, on the south side, which measures 4,500 cubits, another 1.25 miles, there will be 3 gates, the gate of Simeon, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then on the west side, which is 1.25 miles in length, there will be 3 gates, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. The distance around will be 18,000 cubits, which is about 5 miles. And the name of the city from that time on will be the Lord is there. In other words, it's going to be changed. The name of the city is going to be changed from Jerusalem to the Lord is there. The book of Ezekiel provides a prophetic structure for Plan A. We have examined the book of Ezekiel and observed many things. In conclusion, here are a few things I would like to offer as a review, because this concludes our study in the book of Ezekiel. Of course, we've not exhausted it by any means. My hope here was to give you enough information to get you started so that you could sit down at your own time and convenience, and with this information behind you, you can understand everything sufficient to grasp what God is trying to say to Ezekiel about Plan A. The first thing we learned in the book of Ezekiel, that God's patience with Israel came to an end because of apostasy. And when Israel filled up their cup of iniquity, God took action. He punished Israel by sending a destroyer. This is not unlike how God deals with all nations. In fact, it's for this reason that we have an Antichrist at the end of the age. Because God's patience with the world will come to an end. The world corporately will fill up its cup of iniquity, and God will punish the world by sending a destroyer. And in Revelation 9, the angel from the abyss, in Hebrew and Greek, his name means the same thing, destroyer, Abaddon or Apollyon. So we find that God's dealing with Israel is but a mirror of how God deals with all nations and even the world in general. We discussed in our study on the book of Ezekiel God's 4 deadly judgments: sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. In Ezekiel 14, starting at verse 12 through 21, we read how that God's 4 deadly judgments were imposed upon Jerusalem. It's interesting because God's 4 deadly judgments mark the beginning of the Great Tribulation: sword, famine, plague, and wild beast. You can read that in Revelation 6, starting at verse 7, where the 4th seal is opened. God's 4 deadly judgments. And when God opens up the 4th seal, when Jesus opens a 4th seal, 25% of the earth will perish. That's more than 1.5 billion people. We found in the case of Jerusalem, in ancient times, God spared 1/3. Remember in chapter 5, verses 10 through 12, God put 1/3 to the sword, and He put 1/3 to the famine, and then He chased 1/3 and scattered them. He spared 1/3. And I've talked to you already in this series at some length about how during the Great Tribulation, God spares 2/3. He's a generous king. And then when the devil spares 2/3 of the wicked, they will wear the number 666 because they constitute the 2/3 that were allowed to live. 666 is 2/3 of 1,000, people being grouped in groups of 1,000. We've learned that God's patience with Israel's rebellion lasted for 70 Sabbath years. In other words, when they violated 70 Sabbath years, God's patience terminated and Israel was put into captivity. It takes 430 years to produce 70 Sabbath years. Remember that in Ezekiel 4, verses 5 and 6? So God's patience came to an end when their 70 Sabbath years ended. And the parallel, I think, that's so interesting is that God's patience with the world, with sin, comes to an end at the end of 70 centuries, 7,000 years. At the end of the last 1,000, the sabbatical millennium, then sin will be destroyed. Number 6, God promised restoration to Israel and the fulfillment of Plan A. God promised Israel the most wonderful and amazing things if only they would listen to His Spirit. But that was the condition. They would have to listen to His Spirit and have a change of heart. That didn't happen. Regrettably, it did not happen. And you know how it came up, how the consequences of it. Jerusalem was destroyed again, and this time forever in AD 70. I say forever, that is with respect to Israel as a nation of people belonging to God. God redefined Israel, and today Israel is all over the world. Israel consists of people who listen to the Spirit and have a born-again experience, change of heart. God explained how the end of sin would occur through Gog and Magog to Ezekiel. He explained how He would purge Israel, how that Israel would pass under His rod, and He would separate those that were not pure in heart. He explained also the destruction of the wicked. All of these things we understand from Plan A and as well as Plan B. God foretold the resurrection of King David so that he could rule on his throne, which He had promised to David. God gave Israel a temple pattern which they were to build for the soles of His feet, because He would come and live among men. He would be their God and they would be His people. Plan A was full of promises and would be fulfilled if Israel listened to the Spirit. And I have to close this seminar with a very sad and regretful conclusion that all of the promises that God offered and all of the wonderful things that He promised, He could not bring about to that Israel. So what did God do? After Christ was rejected, He redefined Israel, because the promises still stand, now in a little different way, but they're fully identified and itemized in the books of Daniel and Revelation, and they stand awaiting fulfillment. And in fact, in our next seminar segment, we're going to begin our study on the book of Daniel, looking at Plan B. Now that Plan A is behind you, or somewhat behind you, I hope that Plan B will make a lot more sense to you. Well, it's been a joy to be with you in this seminar series on the book of Ezekiel. I hope that you will subscribe to the Tape of the Month and get the series on the book of Daniel. And better yet, why not order the book so that you can follow along in the book as we go through this series on the book of Daniel. May God bless you and keep you, is my prayer.